Okay, Alex. So before becoming the world's most popular man when it comes to COVID, you had already embarked on being the most popular journalist in America when it comes to marijuana. What's the deal, man? Why can't you just go along to get along?
I mean, I guess I'm a contrarian by nature. I didn't think that was what reporters were supposed to do. I thought reporters were supposed to challenge, orthodoxy and, look for the sort of hidden motives or sometimes the not so hidden motives that people have. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure to legalize cannabis. There's a lot of, cultural pressure, political pressure, financial pressure. And that has led to some essentially lies about what this drug is and what it can do to people and the dangers of it. And by the way, you can know all that stuff and still think that cannabis should be legal. People always say, well, what about alcohol? Yeah, I mean, alcohol causes lots of problems. I don't think anybody would dispute that, but it's legal. We think culturally it's important. A lot of people like it. A lot of people use it. I mean, I personally drink. So it's not about, I mean, whether or not you should legalize cannabis is a different question than whether or not we're doing this sort of under false pretenses. That's what bothers me as.
And that's what interests me in your book and, quite honestly, your position on the news cycle and the quote unquote current thing. It's not really about whether or not I agree. I'm not necessarily a prude when it comes to, as you mentioned, alcohol. I wouldn't even want to paint myself as a prude when it comes to marijuana. But it's less about what I think is right for me or even you, and more about whether or not we are truly curious people willing to critically think about something that we have accepted with such a rapid, not just accepted, but I think probably encouraged. We've moved from marijuana is bad to marijuana should be tolerated to really the popular cultural narrative is now marijuana is good. We have moved there at breakneck speed with almost no critical thinking. And that's what I think you've done here when it comes to tell your children the truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence.
I think you're right, and I mean, part of that is that it's the pendulum swung, right? So people, especially before 1970, let's say, you could get in a lot of trouble for using like a small amount of pot. I mean, people in Texas would actually be sentenced, to felony prison sentences for possession of, let's say, an ounce. And, but that was a long time ago, but that's sort of what informed, I would say, the narrative, this idea that, this is a relatively mild drug. And the reason people are being punished for it is because they're poor or black and they're, and that's not fair. And or they're hippies, right? I mean, that was hippies was a real term that was used in the 1960s, and it was generally not a positive term, at least in the eyes of the establishment. So that's where this comes from. There's people have a big chip on their shoulders about marijuana, but what they've sort of, I think, forgotten, to my mind, is they're the establishment now. The cultural gatekeepers and a lot of people in the media, they're not anti-pot in any way right now. They're very pro, and it is actually kind of amazing to see how quickly the pendulum has swung.
And I'm less interested, Alex, even in the course of our conversation here over the next half hour or so, I'm less interested in the prohibitionist mindset. I'm actually less interested in the legal framework than I am in the health choices that we make or that we allow our children to make when it comes to not just marijuana, but alcohol or food, sugar, whatever it may be. I think that living up to our physical optimum capabilities is increasingly attractive to me. And we have, as I said, and as you've said, we've moved in this place where it's the popular conception that marijuana is a universal good and has very little downside. And I know that your book focuses specifically on psychosis and marijuana's contribution to psychotic breaks and potentially violence. But before we get there, I just want you to kind of address that idea that what are the downsides to marijuana?
Sure. I mean, so it's very, marijuana, or cannabis, as I like to call it, because that's sort of the more scientific name. And I think it's a drug we should treat with respect. But cannabis is, it's interesting. The advocates like to say it's this magic medicine, right? That it works for everything. It works for Crohn's disease, and it works for migraines, and it works. Some of the the real crazy say it works for cancer. It works for this. It works for that. Look, there's no one plant or chemical or anything that could possibly work for all those things, right? The body is incredibly complicated, right? So, as I write in Tell Your Children, the great success of the legalization movement was selling cannabis as medicine. Because I think Americans tend to be pretty fair people. And, this idea of, there's some 25-year-old man in San Francisco who's dying of AIDS. This is in 1996 when we had no treatments for AIDS. Let him smoke, and he won't have to worry about wasting away as much. Or there's some 60-year-old woman with breast cancer, and this can help her nausea. And so that was kind of the nose in the door. The sad truth, unfortunately, is that even for the stuff you would think it would work best for, essentially pain as a pain treatment, and even for something like as an anti-nauseant, it doesn't work that well. Cannabis and THC. It was surprising to me when I looked at the data how weak the data was, and then go look at the other side. Put aside the mental health issues for a minute. Cannabis actually is not good for you physically in terms of your heart. Okay, there's a real association with heart attacks in younger people who use cannabis, and it's not entirely clear that's why that is. It may have some blood pressure effects, and then of course it's something you smoke. So if you smoke too much of anything, it's probably not good for your lungs. Although interestingly, you can't really find a strong link between cannabis and lung cancer. Maybe because it's people smoke 20, 30, 40 cigarettes a day. They might smoke a couple of joints a day, but cannabis is a pretty high tar product, and so it would be somewhat surprising if it didn't have some negative effects on the lungs. Although again, that connection is not as strong, certainly not as strong as cigarettes. So this idea that it's some magic medicine is just it's just nonsense.
Well, let's stay on this pros and cons of cannabis for just one moment, and let's do it through the lens of the popularly accepted story. Let me focus on the pros for a moment. The story in support of marijuana out there amongst the culture, if not the field of medicine, would be that, look, it helps with glaucoma. It helps as a pain reliever. It's better than alcohol or opiates, and that it helps with anxiety. Are those not legitimate pros to cannabis?
I would say they're basically not legitimate pros. Glaucoma, there's no scientific evidence it does any good. Anxiety, it can work in the short term, just the way prescription anti-anxiety drugs can work. The problem with both cannabis and those medicines is that if you stop using, you can get really bad rebound anxiety, which is why ask anybody who's tried to quit Valium, right? It's easy to start using those drugs, and it's hard to quit. And it's the same thing with cannabis. Is it safer than alcohol? It is physically safer than alcohol, absolutely, because alcohol, as we all know, in high quantities, can be lethal. People will throw up and they'll die, or their livers will just shut down and they'll die. That does happen. That basically can't really happen with cannabis, although very small children can ingest enough THC that it can actually kill them. But generally that can't really happen with adults. So I would agree, as an intoxicant, it's physically safer than alcohol. And it's certainly physically safer than opioids as an intoxicant. You can't, you're not going to overdose and stop breathing and die. But those are, that's sort of a thin defense, that it's less physically dangerous than these other intoxicants. But to me, that's how you should view it. It's an intoxicant, and it has pros and cons. The pros are that it's less physically dangerous. The cons are that I think, the mental health risks are actually considerably higher for cannabis than for alcohol.
And I want to get to those mental health risks on the con side of this ledger, but I want to stay with the sort of popular story or popularly accepted narrative of cannabis for just 1 second. So, and again, this is before we get to the idea of psychosis, schizophrenia, a contribution to violence. But the popularly accepted con to cannabis is one that goes like this. It makes you lazy. It makes you less motivated. It will hinder your ability to achieve academically or even within employment. Do you think those are legitimate cons?
Oh, yeah. But See, I don't talk about that in the book very much. And in fact, a very pro cannabis advocate said to me, "You should talk about those things. Those are the real problems with the drug. That it sort of grinds people's lives a little bit. You see people who don't, who had a lot of promise, and 20 years later they're not doing that much, and they're just kind of high all the time. And that's the real problem with the drug. Look, that's not a life choice that I've made. That's obviously not a life choice that you've made. That to me, if people are are okay, kind of letting their lives go by on on a wave of being high, I don't. I think that's a mistake. But that to me is almost a feature and not a bug of the drug, right? So people who use heavily, I think they, to some extent, they know what they're doing. They know they're kind of putting themselves in neutral and letting the world go by. And as long as they don't have children or family responsibilities, um, the libertarian, that's the libertarian side of me, where I don't really have a problem with that. I don't like it, and as a society we can't have everybody doing it. But that's why people use, right? And they use because, let's be honest, it's pleasurable, right? Being high, being drunk, those are pleasurable feelings. And certainly with cannabis, people like to listen to music, they like to eat, they like to have sex. Like, cannabis is a drug that makes pleasurable things more pleasurable. And to me, that's really the ultimate pro of the drug. It's but we can't pretend that that's not why people are using it.
And that's why I said that what appeals to me, and we're going to, again, as I've teased it several times, going to get to the crux of your book, but that's why what appeals to me about looking at this drug critically is less about the prohibition mindset and more about the health mindset. Because you're right, there's a libertarian inside of me as well that says, look, if you want to waste your life away, if you want to live a life of hedonism, that's fine. Go do what you want to do. I think what you're alluding to is there's no negative externalities to you living that way unless you have children. And of course, if it leads to psychosis or violence, which we get to in a moment, that's a negative externality. But I still think that people should be aware, because I do think, to me, the biggest takeaway and what your book contributes to here is, let's think critically about something. And look, this is what appealed to me about you when it came to COVID. It's like, we have to accept the premise with no counterpoint, no rebuttal, and no critical thinking. Because why? Because it's the current thing, because it's cool. And I do think the current thing and what's cool about marijuana is to accept it, or cannabis, is to just accept it as not just a net positive, but really, look, if I used to have a sports radio show, Alex, on ESPN, and if I said, look, marijuana decreases your motivation, let's not paint it as an all-encompassing good, I would get massive criticism for that. The advocates for marijuana want to have the rest of us believe, when it comes to a lifestyle choice or a health choice, that there is nothing bad about cannabis.
That's right. And by the way, we've seen, some strange behavior from certain, from pro athletes that, may or may not be cannabis related. And I don't want to name names without the specifics in front of me, but there's been cases where notable athletes have had psychotic breaks, have wound up, briefly hospitalized, and there's a couple days of stories written about it, and then it sort of goes away. And I do think, given the amount of cannabis use in, by pro athletes, there's in some cases a potentially clear connection there. Which, but here's another point, and this, again, we're not exactly talking about the psychosis issue head on, but a lot of people have bad trips, right? Especially when they're smoking, they're vaping pure THC, or they're using edibles where it's, very hard to titrate, right? The joke about edibles is, you take one and nothing happens. An hour later, you take another, nothing happens. A half hour later, you take a third one. And then a half hour after that, you're like, get me to the emergency room, right? And that really does happen to people. But as a society, and this is almost gaslighting. What we tell people is, oh, yeah, you thought the neighbors were going to gouge your eyes out and you wound up in the ER. Ha ha. Like, that was a bad one. Maybe take a little bit less tomorrow. Well, no, like, maybe you actually shouldn't use anymore, or you shouldn't use for a long time at least. And you should figure out why you had that reaction. But we've sort of normalized a certain amount of pretty high grade apparent people who take that seriously.
Yeah, so that's a great jumping off point into the actual argument in your book, which is, again, like we have said, less about motivation and less about lifestyle choices, and even less about whether or not marijuana is a net or cannabis is a net benefit for, say, glaucoma. But your contention in the book is that, and I believe that I read this correctly, heavy use of marijuana can, in some percentage of users, lead to psychotic breaks, can lead to psychosis, can lead to then violence. Give us, in essence, the boil it down as to what you are suggesting is the link between cannabis and violence.
Sure. So cannabis can clearly cause temporary psychotic episodes. I don't even think the industry would. Again, people wind up in the ER. Go to an ER in a major city on a Friday night or a Tuesday night, and you will see people who are brought in, who are having a psychotic reaction to cannabis. Okay, so I would say the bigger, more important question is whether or not, if you smoke a lot and if you smoke over a long period of time, and certainly if you start in your mid-teens, let's say, when your brain is still very much developing, whether you're going to be at higher risk for schizophrenia, which is essentially permanent psychosis. Although, people with schizophrenia can recover, but it's a very schizophrenia is a terrible illness. It really destroys people's lives. So even putting aside the permanent psychosis question, there is no question that cannabis can lead to temporary psychotic episodes. And then
and Alex, really quickly, on the temporary psychosis you're talking about, the temporary psychotic break, would that include the traditional, conception of somebody being paranoid for the night while they're on cannabis? Would that be classified as a temporary psychotic break?
It sort of depends how seriously paranoid you get, right? So if you're like, my friends are talking about me, you're not going to be classified as psychotic. You might be, you might be that. The doctor's gonna tell you're having a panic attack, or you just need to chill out. But if you think that cop who drove by 3 times is gonna bust in my door and shoot me, and I better get my gun and shoot him first. Now you've gone into a psychotic state. Whether or not you're hearing voices at that point, it is less important than the fact that the content of your thoughts is so out of control that you think you're in physical danger when you are not. So it's sort of definitionally you're having a psychotic break at that point. And one of the bad things about cannabis psychosis specifically is, and this has actually been studied, people who smoke or people who are having a psychotic break that is cannabis flavored, right, cannabis influenced, tend to have persecutory delusions, right? So that's that my friends are talking about me, or my friends who aren't even in this room are talking about me. That persecutory delusion is a risk factor for violence for pretty clear reasons, right? If you think you're in danger, you are likely to want to protect yourself. And protecting yourself can mean hurting someone else who you think is endangering you. So psychosis, and this is something that the mental health community and the community of people who are advocates for people with mental illness hate to talk about this. They hate to talk about it. Psychosis is a major risk factor for violence. It's a major risk factor for both committing violence and being the victim of violence. But as I write in the book, when if you're on a subway platform and there's somebody talking to himself or screaming about God, and they and that person clearly hasn't showered in a week, and they're sort of staggering around, you are going to go to the other side of the platform, because intuitively that person doesn't have full control of his faculties, and that he's dangerous to himself, dangerous to you. And so psychosis does cause a significant amount of violence in the United States, and we just don't talk about how much, but it does.
And then your contention is that, again, and I think this is important, and I'm going to press you, I'm going to play devil's advocate in just a moment, but your contention is, on top of whatever psychosis that can be experienced in some percentage of users. I think that's important to underline. You're not arguing that every trip or every user arrives at this place, but some percentage of users that is not insignificant in your estimation not only have a psychic or psychosis or break or deal with psychosis while they're on marijuana, but for some percentage of users, habitual, long-term, or heavy use can lead to schizophrenia, which is, and I think the definition in your book is months, according to psychiatrists, where you start having delusions that last months, independent of whether or not you're high. And your contention is that for heavy users of marijuana, it can lead to that level of psychosis, schizophrenia.
That's right. So here's the thing. There's going to be some percentage of people who are totally genetically healthy, okay, and probably they can smoke their whole lives, and nothing's going to happen to them. And then there's some percentage of people who are going to develop schizophrenia no matter what, okay. And then there's a group of people in the middle, and it's not a large group of people, okay, but it is, even if it's one person in 300, given how dangerous or how terrible schizophrenia is on a societal basis, that's a lot of people, and for those people it's a horrible thing. There's some percentage of people who probably wouldn't have developed full-bore schizophrenia. And they might have had weird thoughts. They might be that weird neighbor down the street who has some odd ideas. Or they, somebody who took 6 years to finish college and had a break at some point, but recovered. Okay, but they got through, and they didn't become schizophrenic. And some percentage of those people, cannabis is going to push over the edge. And for some of those people, it might be relatively moderate use. For more of those people, it's going to be pretty heavy use. The other thing that is very, very clear is that if you have a diagnosed mental illness, you shouldn't use, okay, because it will worsen your symptoms. I think, again, even the industry doesn't really disagree with that. But those people,
and you're not in that realm. You're not limiting it to schizophrenia. You're talking about depression, bipolar disorder,
I would say
all host of mental illness.
Bipolar disorder, severe depression, anxiety disorders. Yeah, I mean, if you have almost anybody can probably be diagnosed with mild depression. So I don't want to sort of play the game where I try to cut 80% of the country out of being able to use. But yeah, if you have a severe mental illness, you shouldn't use. And because of the way the drug's been marketed, those people are actually quite likely to use, right? You're told this is good for anxiety, this is good for depression. That's absolutely untrue. Okay, there's been a lot of work done about this. Cannabis is either a 0 or a negative if you have mild to moderate mental illness. Again, it's something you should, if you want to use it to get high, use it to get high, but don't pretend you are treating these psychiatric diseases with it, because you're just masking the symptoms and potentially making it worse.
Okay, I want to ease into playing devil's advocate for a moment, but first this is my suspicion, Alex, that you're somebody watching or listening right now, listening on the podcast or watching on YouTube, you're probably going to deal with two immediate realms of skepticism at top line. One is, I don't know what the percentages are. I think you do, on the number of people who've used marijuana, even in the last month. And the vast majority of people listening or watching will say, I have not experienced what you're describing, nor have I even witnessed what you're describing. I've seen mild paranoia. I've never seen psychotic breaks. And at the same time, they're saying to themselves, I've seen terrible behavior on alcohol, and I've seen lives wasted away on opiates. So they're immediately playing the comparison game, which we talked about earlier, and they have no direct personal experience with marijuana leading to these extreme outcomes, at least that they know of. That's one thing I think you're dealing with right away.
I think that's less true than it used to be, actually. Because the current strength of both flower cannabis and the pure products is enough that even experienced users can have these problems. And I think one very, very interesting data point that's come up in the last few months is that, so you think legalization would make cannabis more like alcohol societally, right? So that, we have a large group of people who use alcohol, once a week, once a month, they don't really have any problems with it. And there's a small group of people who use every day, use heavily every day. Then those people account for a lot of the problems with alcohol. So the expectation when you legalize marijuana is, hey, there's going to be this large group of people who start to sample this and they like it and they don't have any problems with it. And they smoke it once in a while. And the heavy users, yeah, they'll still use, but we're not necessarily going to see a large increase in those people. It's actually exactly the opposite thing that has happened. It's the number of people who use daily or near daily has gone up because it's easier to use legally. You don't have to worry about consequences if you're pulled over as much. It's your legal envelope widens, and it's easier to get. Right, you can go to a dispensary, you can buy it. It's easier. Those people like using lots of cannabis. But there hasn't been a very big rise in the number of people who use casually. So what you're seeing actually is people segmenting themselves either into heavy user or non-user. And the heavy users, again, those people can have problems even if they haven't had problems using, for years, because it is it sort of can sneak up on you. Suddenly you're finding yourself, you were smoking to hide your anxiety. Suddenly your anxiety is worse. Suddenly you're starting to have paranoid thoughts. And I think I would disagree with you that this is not getting more common. And look, I hear from the people who have problems.
Okay.
So it's a little so my sample size is a little biased, but I hear from parents and I even hear from users saying, you know, what you're saying is true.
So we'll come back to that other level of top-line skepticism that I alluded to in just one moment. But I think I need to follow up on what I think is one of the most fascinating parts of your book, and that is understanding cannabis. I'm going to use the term marijuana now because I think it's in the realm of popular culture, what we're talking about. The level of THC in the drug that most people take. I found this fascinating. And look, with legalization, I think more people – here's one maybe benefit to legalization, Alex. I think if you had asked somebody in the 1970s, 80s, and even into the 90s, define for me THC or tell me what level of THC is in what you're taking, it'd be a complete mystery. It'd be like drinking moonshine alcohol at all times. I have no idea what the proof of this is, right? But now people are more aware of milligrams, for example. Like, okay, this says this is a 2.5 milligram tablet. This says this is a 10 milligram edible. And people know more about what a milligram or 10 or 2 do to them. But what you lay out very fascinatingly is while we might have more input, what people were smoking in the 1970s, the hippie you mentioned earlier, it's not even in the same realm of what people are taking today.
That's right. I mean, and that's unquestionable too. And there wasn't this, there weren't extracts in the same way. No, people would smoke. I mean, stuff that was 5, 6, 7% THC would be considered very strong. 10%, you're really smoking the strong stuff. That would get you laughed out of a dispensary now. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people are using more. I mean, this is what the industry says. Oh, you can smoke a lot of low potency cannabis and get, just as much THC as smoking a little bit of high potency cannabis. And, therefore the higher potency stuff just will save your lungs. But that's kind of a BS argument. Well, honestly, most people who want to use high potency stuff, and they wind up using more of it, and they wind up dosing more and more. And I will tell you, this was an amazing thing to me. 2.5 milligrams, if you're not an experienced cannabis user, that's usually considered one drink. Okay, so people say, you know what, you
Right.
want to feel what this feels like a little bit, have 2.5 milligrams, have 5 milligrams, take it, go slow, take it easy. People would say to me, I'm using 200 milligrams a day. I'm using 400 milligrams.
Wow.
I had people tell me they were using a gram of THC a day. A gram of THC would be the equivalent of 400 drinks in a day. Obviously nobody's drinking 400 drinks in a day, would kill everybody. But because this stuff isn't so physically potent, it's not as physically dangerous, you can use these massive amounts of it. And I'm telling you, if you're using, 2, 3, 400 milligrams of THC a day, much less, more than that, you are high all the time, and you are affecting your brain in ways that I don't think can possibly be good for it.
So you really put this into context in the book for me as well. The popular image of cannabis I don't want to keep hearkening back to the 1970s, but it's like, that's when it hit. That's when it hit the top line of culture, when it stopped being so taboo. How about that? And you picture a bunch of people sitting around in a circle passing a joint around. And you said the joint that group would have passed around would have imparted to everyone, if you're sitting there with 4 or 5 people, it probably would have given you 1 milligram to 2 milligrams of THC, the joint that everyone shared. Where you're talking about now, as you said, like 5 milligrams is nothing. Like you go to a dispensary, a 5 milligram tablet is absolutely nothing. 10 seems to be the sort of like middle ground, and many people are taking way more. So in essence, we're taking 10 to 20. I'm talking about, this is probably the casual users, 10 to 20, the level of cannabis that was in that popular image from 50 years ago. And now we get to the heavy users, which you're talking about,
Right.
which takes me back to the second level of skepticism real quick. And that's now tying it to the effects on mental health, as you said, psychosis. Here, before we start addressing that directly, I think the other thing people are going to have trouble with is in our minds, and you started to address this, schizophrenia and diseases of the mind like that are generally believed, I think it's fair to say, not environmental, but genetic. And so therefore you're making the case to us, no, it's not all genetic. You can do things to your brain to push you into psychosis and even permanent psychosis of schizophrenia.
Oh yeah, I mean, and this is, I would say, not. This is a case where the popular understanding and the scientific understanding are different, right? So scientists would generally say for a disease like schizophrenia, it looks like it's about half genetic, about half environmental. So, if you look at identical twins, just because one gets schizophrenia, it does not mean the other one is going to get schizophrenia. But yes, we all know families where there's a streak of mental illness, or there's a streak of drug addiction, or that's a real thing too. So it's genes and environment. And by the way, the number one thing people can do or not do is drug use. Really, there are people. Certainly, children and teenagers don't necessarily have that much control over their home environments, but people can choose to use or not use drugs.
So, okay, now I'm going to play direct devil's advocate on some of the stuff. First of all, I think, and I've read your book, and I have some personal experience, as almost everyone does now with mental illness. And, Alex, I come away from this, like, and you go back a century or more on your research, but schizophrenia to me is I know that the American Psychiatry Association has a DSM definition. I know that it's quote unquote science, but Alex, it's a very difficult concept to define. And so, so if we start making links between a drug and a disease, what's difficult for me about that, Alex, is the disease itself is hard to define. Like, what is schizophrenia? And that's not to deny that it exists, but in order for me to make a causal link, like this causes this, well, then I need to know what this is.
And I agree. And, psychiatrists have had a problem with this for a long time. If you have cancer, you can see the tumor, right? If you have a heart disease and a heart attack, you can see the blockage in the arteries. It is essentially impossible on a brain scan to say this person is schizophrenic, this person is not. But that does not mean it's not a real illness. People, if you have voices screaming at you day after day, if you're seeing things that are not there, and you're willing to sort of acknowledge those things to a psychiatrist, they're going to be able to make a diagnosis. And as I say in the book, it does get complicated because, for example, if you're 90 years old and your memory's shot and suddenly you start hallucinating, you have dementia, right? Or if
Right.
if you're 40 and suddenly you're waking up in the middle of the night with night sweats, and then all of a sudden you start hallucinating, they're going to check you for a brain tumor, right? So there can be cases of physical, brain impairment that are actually going to be visible, that can be, that can be used to differentiate those things from schizophrenia. But schizophrenia
And even the overlap of bipolar and schizophrenia is look, again, I'm not holding myself out as an expert. I'm holding myself out as someone who has naive ignorance. But the overlap is hard to parse out, the difference between bipolar and schizophrenia. And the reason that's important to our conversation is your contention is the drug itself can lead to schizophrenia, and that has a connection to violence.
So bipolar disorder, when people can have, certainly when they're getting manic, and sort of the up stage of bipolar disorder, there's a lot of psychosis associated with that. People don't sleep; they literally do not sleep for days and days and days, and then they can get psychotic. And oftentimes there's pretty heavy drug use associated with that part of bipolar disorder. There is even a good doctor can sometimes, a really well-trained, experienced psychiatrist can have a bit of a problem early on distinguishing between somebody who's having, a manic episode, who's in a, first schizophrenic break, especially if there's drugs involved. So, but these diseases are hard to diagnose, but that does not mean they're real. Or I'm sorry, that does not mean they're not real. They are very real.
Right.
There's a very
Right.
good piece. So the New York Times Magazine wrote a piece a few months ago, and these pieces get written every couple of years, and it's basically like, hey, schizophrenia isn't that bad. We don't necessarily need drugs and locked wards. People can, sort of handle themselves, and there's a gentler way to do this. And let me tell you, my wife is a psychiatrist. Okay, there if you are well enough to sit down for a long interview with the New York Times about the voices you're hearing, you are sort of definitionally not in the middle of a florid psychotic episode. Okay, so just because these things are hard to diagnose, and I agree with you, they're hard to diagnose, and we don't want to stigmatize people, that doesn't mean they're not real. That doesn't mean the pain they cause to the people who are using them is not real, and that doesn't mean that that the violence they can cause is not real. Those things are all real. And so anything we can do, to my mind, that reduces those outcomes is something we should be trying to do.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, by the way. My skepticism towards the precision of diagnosis isn't to deny that the illness exists, but it is to inject, I think, a healthy level of skepticism in your contention that the drug can lead directly to violence in some. And I'm not rejecting your contention. I'm doing what I think is the proper thing, and I know you do as well, is try to poke holes. And let's see if this holds up.
You should try to poke holes. And, you're being much gentler to me than the cannabis advocates are. So please hit me as hard as you like.
Well, that's because I didn't come into this with a set conclusion. I'm not an advocate. I'm just a curious person in this. I do think your argument suffers a little bit, and I know you've already addressed this, but I don't know that you fully crossed the hurdle on correlation versus causation. And so the argument would go, twofold. One, everyone knows what a correlation is. Two things simultaneously happen at the same time, but they're not necessarily directly connected. Causation, drug use, heavy drug use of cannabis can lead to psychosis and schizophrenia. I think the biggest trouble is it's hard to tease out chicken and egg, actually. Do the people that already suffer from schizophrenia or mental illness gravitate towards drug use, and therefore you have this connection, or is the drug use coming first and leading to the psychosis and the schizophrenia?
The classic example of this is people say, well, ice cream sales go up in the summer and drownings go up. Does that mean, eating ice cream causes drownings? No, of course not, right? Those are both things that, people swim more in the summer, there's hot weather, and they eat more ice cream. So yes. And then, as you say, there's even another, stage to that, which was reverse causation. In other words, that the mental illness is causing the drug use, not the other way around. People are self-medicating, trying to feel better. And here's the thing: those questions have been asked really since the very first paper. There was a seminal paper that came out in 1987 about Swedish conscripts. I talk about it, fairly extensively in Tell Your Children. And although it is hard to do, I would say there's been enough work done now that we can say that in general drug use is preceding the break. And I'll tell you an example. So in the Netherlands, for example, they have very good it's called longitudinal data. So the best way to figure this out is to follow the same people year after year, right? So what you really want is to follow 1,000 teenagers from the time they're 12 to the time they're 23 and track their drug use and see who becomes mentally ill or not. And that's very labor intensive, and there's privacy issues. It's complicated, but you can do it. And when those studies have been done and done well, they show, let's say somebody's using at 13 and they're becoming ill at 15. But becoming ill at 13 does not lead to use at 15. So when you actually follow individuals, you see this. And not every individual, right? Some people are going to use a lot and not become ill at all. Some people are going to become, some people are going to become mentally ill and then they'll, as simultaneous with using a lot, right? So there's all kinds of individual variability. But when you look at the big pattern, you see that cannabis use, drug use in general, but cannabis use particularly, tends to precede the mental illness.
Okay, what about this, though? You talked about multivariables. I think this would be hard, if not impossible, to isolate drug use from other contributors to maybe mental illness, but definitely violence. And that would be, the break in the family bonds, maybe a father not at home, choosing peers who are, more prone to edgy or rule-breaking behavior, just a general contribution of life choices. And drug use is just one of those that leads to these types of situations.
You are absolutely correct that drug use is sort of highly correlated with all of those things. And it is hard to pull out drug use from those. Which is why it is so striking that you can find studies that try to account for all those variables and do show cannabis, as well as alcohol, as well as cocaine and methamphetamine, not so much opioids. Opioids just make people go to sleep, right? But cannabis, alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, and the stimulants are connected to violence, even after you factor that stuff out. I think you make an interesting point, and let me sort of play devil's advocate to myself on it, which is cannabis use clearly, in general, predates other quote unquote harder drug use, right? So this gateway theory is definitely true in terms of people who use cannabis are much more likely to use other drugs. However, to me, that all by itself does not in any way prove that cannabis causes those other drugs to be used. And why? For exactly what you said. The same people who are smoking cannabis are, they're likely to have others, they're likely to, especially if they're using young, to be in a fatherless house, to be around other people who are violent, so to be at sort of societal disadvantage. And so they may also personally just be risk takers, right? If they weren't smoking pot at 13,
right,
they'd be on their dirt bike going 100 miles an hour or whatever it is. So in that case, cannabis use doesn't necessarily lead to heavier drug use, even though it predates it. But let me go back to an argument I make in the book. Even when you factor out those other factors, you do sometimes, and the best of work on this is with twin studies, because if you have identical twins, you're controlling for genetics, and they generally live in the same house, so you're controlling for environment. Even when you look at those people, at twins, you see that a twin who uses cannabis is more likely to use other drugs later. So what I'm telling you is you are right to have all these good questions, to raise all the skeptical stuff. But scientists have spent a long time trying to answer these questions. And though they don't have definitive answers, they do have pretty strong signals.
One more. Your contention, to take this full circle, is you don't care about the life choices that people make. You care about the negative externalities. You care about the potential for violence. Okay, that's a cost-benefit equation now. So what I would ask you is, does the potential cost of heavy marijuana use, and we should stop for just a moment, I should say, in the book, Alex lays out, and he has on his Substack and other places, he advocates for decriminalization, but not legalization. And that keeps the drug in the world of stigma, and discouragement, but not punishment with not punishment through the legal system for users, for those that possess. So back to sort of why you believe that is you worry about the violence. What about the violence of the illicit drug trade? So if we're going to do this, right, and we're going to say, okay, the measure is not so much the health and lifestyle choices, the measure is the violence. Is the potential violence of people having psychotic breaks and schizophrenia greater than the violence associated with street gangs and everything else that goes along with keeping this drug on the black market? Which is greater?
And 10 years ago, I would say we don't have an answer. Unfortunately, we do have the answer now. The answer is that when you legalize, you continue to have a black market. You have a huge black market in California, in Colorado, because there's a cultural history around this drug being illegal. There's large networks of sort of black market suppliers who are not just going to go away. But B, there's taxes and regulations and having a store. And if and this is a plant that you can grow, okay, very, not very easily, but pretty easily. And so the cost of commercially, dealing with all this stuff is non-zero. All right. And it turns out that the illicit market can undercut the legal market, especially in states where you legalize, right? Because the best place to hide an illegal cannabis grow is in the middle of a legal cannabis grow. So essentially, you have very low cost illicit product still available, still being sold through these black market networks in California. So and everywhere else. So you get all the downside of a continuing illicit market, plus you're introducing the drug to a bunch of people who wouldn't have it had it before, even though, again, a lot of those people try it a couple times and then turn away. Plus you have advertising, plus you have the lack of societal stigma. And your comment about stigma reminded me of a point I like to make, okay? The drug in general, drug legalizers, they're so smart, okay? Well, and they say we shouldn't stigmatize. We shouldn't stigmatize the user. It's mean to the user. It doesn't discourage use. And I say to you, that's total nonsense, okay? We stigmatize drinking and driving, and people drink and drive less than they did 40 years ago. We have stigmatized domestic violence, and it's no longer okay to slap your girlfriend around, okay? And you'll be arrested for it. 40 years ago, you wouldn't have been arrested for it. Now you would. We've stigmatized tobacco use. We have stigmatized the bejesus out of tobacco use, and we have saved a lot of lives by doing that. Okay, so when did stigmatizing behaviors we don't want to stick with, that we think are bad, become a bad idea? It's a very good idea, and we should stigmatize.
I'm with you. We've turned stigmatizing anything into sort of the ultimate sin. It's kind of interesting. You brought up your wife being a psychiatrist earlier, and you talked about like this growing movement to think that schizophrenia isn't even a real thing, or maybe it shouldn't be stigmatized in some way. And mental illnesses shouldn't be stigmatized, but we should see it as, I think we're moving towards a world of complete subjectivity, Alex, like embrace of subjectivity, that if somebody else, either clinically or just by choice, sees the world differently, you hear people in the street go, that's your reality. That's not my reality. Reality is all subjective. It seems like an inevitable place we will get where schizophrenia is just another person's reality. I think we're headed there. And that's part of there is no such thing as objective reality, and there is no such thing as right or wrong.
I hope you're wrong, because that'd be a dangerous place for all of us. I really do.
I think we're headed there. So I'm not going to bring this full circle now and land this plane, but, and I don't mean to be too trite, because, look, people used to, use leeches to solve medical problems, and so things that we have believed for centuries are not always, the good barometer. But I also think that accumulated human wisdom over millennia is worth at least paying attention to. And I actually found it pretty compelling in your book that, marijuana, cannabis use, which was called marijuana in Mexico, in ganja, in India, was stigmatized, to your point, going back centuries. And that people that used in those cultures were generally considered to be mentally unhealthy. And I actually find that pretty compelling, that from its beginning, people, even long before medicine could diagnose any connection with psychosis, were looking at this and going, that's not good. He's lost his mind.
Yeah, no, to me, that was one of the most fascinating things that I came across in the book, realizing that this has been under discussion for hundreds of years, and I think it's a little bit like opioids. Okay, you know, somehow in the 1990s we decided we could outsmart biology. We decided, hey, we can handle opioids. They don't have to be dangerous. It'll be great. We'll get rid of everybody's pain. You don't have to be in any pain ever. You just need a little bit of OxyContin. And, what were we thinking, right? People have known
Right.
for centuries that opioids are addictive and they ruin people's lives very quickly in some cases, and they kill. And suddenly we had a bunch of doctors and a bunch of self-interested companies pushing this. And it's exactly the same thing with cannabis. Now, cannabis, it doesn't cause the same number of overdoses. Again, so the crisis is sort of more slow motion, but it is the same problem. And by the way, I'm not going to accept alcohol from this. We should not have alcohol ads on TV. And, by the way, this may be an unpopular position at ESPN or Fox or wherever, but, we really shouldn't have beer, much less wine and hard alcohol ads on sporting events. People are going to drink, but that doesn't mean that as a society we should encourage each other to drink. Okay, and that you can't rewrite or outsmart biology. We're all human. We're all fallible, and we all have to kind of look out for each other on this stuff.
So and that's where I come to in the end, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. The fascinating thing is you wrote this in 2019, right before you became, I think it's fair to say, infamous when it comes to COVID. So you had long embarked on the career of being a contrarian and less popular amongst your peers than is deserved. But what I enjoyed is that the same quality exists on both subjects. The willingness to critically think about something that has been preached as orthodoxy, as dogma. And I think that for anyone out there, it's not that you're going to go into psychosis and you're going to get schizophrenia and you're going to commit violence, but that, like everything else in life, we should understand the risks and the rewards. Yeah. And we should understand the cost-benefit analysis and not pretend this is a universal good. And so that's what you've introduced into the conversation. I appreciate it. By the way, I know we're somewhat tight on time. You've got stuff up right now at the Substack about the mRNA vaccine, how long it provides immunity versus natural immunity. You're talking about this, in my estimation, abhorrent move to start pushing the vaccine onto children under 5. And you're continuing to provide critical thought on that subject.
We could certainly talk for another hour about that, but I will just say, without going into the details, because it's a whole nother conversation. I would say that my understanding of the way that sort of I was treated and Tell Your Children was treated by people I knew, frankly, at the New York Times and elsewhere, informed my understanding of what was happening with our conversations around COVID, which is that the media, in a way that probably had never happened before Donald Trump sort of broke the brains of, a lot of woke journalists, would assume a position and then just refuse to think critically about it. And so, look, Tell Your Children, again, you can disagree with portions of it, or you can say, hey, this is all true, but I don't care. This drug needs to be legal anyway. It's just a matter of fairness. That's fine. But to sort of dismiss it and mock it as being, silly or reefer madness, that's not the kind of journalist I am. That's not the book that it is. And so when I saw COVID, when I saw the sort of ideological lines for me, I just realized in March of 2020 that we were not going to have honest conversations about this, and that I just had to try. Whether or not I've succeeded at all, I don't know. But there need to be critical thinkers as journalists, treating the public health authority the way you would treat the military or any other government organization. We need to, or big business, you need to ask questions of these people.
Alex Berenson, I always enjoy reading your thoughts and hearing from you as well. Man, I really appreciate the amount of time you gave us today. Thank you.
Well, great pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.